Hello and welcome to the very first panel of our DAL Global Virtual Summit. This first panel will be discussing the Israel-Gaza conflict and navigating the crisis internally at work. It goes without saying that we are in hugely challenging and unprecedented times. We approach this panel with a learning mindset and from a stance where we do not claim to have all of the answers and solutions. However, with our wonderful panelists, we hope to provide a forum for discussion, insight, and a continued learning journey. In times of crisis like the Israel-Gaza conflict, employees look to their leaders to step up and show that they care. Conflicts like this can affect employee well-being, require leaders to really take a stance in creating that safe environment, in particular for those that may be affected, whilst also acknowledging the crisis. We're going to be focusing on the conflict's impact on employees, workplaces, and how CEOs and leaders can really address sensitive geopolitical issues like this and provide guidance on how to manage those complex conversations with transparency and sensitivity. We're going to be delving into everything from strategies to foster an inclusive culture and respectful workplace, an environment during these times, leading with practices for promoting constructive dialogue and understanding amongst employees with diverse perspectives, and finally, cultivating a culture of empathy, tolerance and support within organizations capable of managing external conflicts like this effectively. But before we dive into the panel, I would love to introduce our three wonderful panelists to the DAL Global virtual stage. They are Sanjay Bandari, Chairman of Kick It Out, David Gravenberg, Chief Innovations and Partnerships Officer at the Centre for Sports and Human Rights, and Ben Page, Global CEO of Ipsos. Before we delve in, I'd love for each of you to give us a little brief intro and talk to us about why this is so important to you before we get into some of the questions. Ben, I'm going to come to yourself first, if I may.
Well, it's an incredibly emotional time for huge numbers of people. I think that the challenge is how you respond to this conflict in Gaza and Israel and the Palestinians alongside the other 141 armed conflicts that are taking place all around the world. And you know, the Ukraine war is still going on. I've got a Ukrainian living with me at home, and I think it is very challenging because this is obviously an incredibly emotional one that's received a huge amount of attention in Western countries. But if you were in Latin America, there's all sorts of other, wherever you are in the world, there's all sorts of other things going on. And I think it's one challenge is what you decide to respond to and what you don't. I did respond on this one, but it is, we do need a bit of context before seeing it entirely in a US, UK sort of telescope. And being a global company does give you a slightly different perspective than if you were just based in the UK or the United States.
And Ben, I know you're terribly passionate holistically about diversity and inclusion. Give us a brief insight before I come across to David and then Sanjay.
Well, I mean, we just know that we're a company in 90 countries with, I don't know, hundreds of nationalities, speaking many, many different languages, trying to get by in English and trying to get along together as one company with more that unites us as professional researchers than divides us with our different ethnic, religious and cultural backgrounds. But I think something like the Gaza-Israel conflict and social media is difficult for a truly international company to negotiate. It's the same with the war in Ukraine. The British and the Americans have one point of view. The French and the Italians, the Indians, the Chinese have slightly different points of view, and that is a challenge if we're honest. Actually, we could talk about that.
And we absolutely will. Thanks so much, Ben. And fascinating to get your insight across the 90 countries. And as you say, many, many hundreds of nationalities. David, coming to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think this current discourse globally on this conflict, which is, part of a series of many conflicts and the complexity of identity that we all wrap ourselves around different aspects of conflict. I really feel that from a business standpoint, from a corporate culture standpoint, this is going, it shows how closely connected and how far apart we are in many ways. And, I think this particular topic means so much to so many people. But it's also, I think, as Ben said, there are so many diverse perspectives and angles and filters and experiences. When you've worked in the Gulf region or you work in West Asia, there's long history and different types of connectivity from looking at it from afar in Los Angeles or somewhere else. So I really feel that setting the right tempo, the right being able to give the right environments for voice and agency for constructive dialogue, and the approach that we take this work is an enormous challenge that every leader and every one of us individually is faced with on, how do we bring our best selves to work, but also leave our bias behind us and drop all the luggage that we like to carry along with us in our lives. I think this is a topic that brings kind of all of that to the forefront, and certainly one that I think has the ability and challenge of defining culture and how we act in society, in our communities, and ultimately at work as well.
Thank you, David. And finally, Sanjay.
Yeah, I suppose there's sort of two questions you're asking, really. Why am I interested in diversity, inclusion, belonging generally, and then more specifically on this topic around Israel and Gaza? I mean, more generally, look, anyone who's from an underrepresented or minority community, it tends to be quite important to you, and you live your entire life as a member, whether consciously, unconsciously, whether you like it or not. Every success you have becomes, a role model for someone else, and you get to choose whether you want to exercise that leadership consciously or unconsciously. And so there comes a certain point where it's better to choose to exercise that consciously. So look, it's about I've been fortunate over my life to have some successes and also overcoming some barriers. And what I would personally like to do is to give other people the kind of help that I didn't necessarily get because I wasn't on the inside, and now I'm on the inside. I want to get more people like me on the inside and more people from underrepresented or minority communities on the inside. So my job is not to pull the ladder up. My job is to extend the hand down to help other people up. So that's why I'm interested in this topic generally. I think on Israel-Gaza specifically, we'll come on to it in the questions, but I think, historically, I've worked a lot in international organizations, just the last 3 or 4 years, really. Predominantly, I'm working in much more national organizations, so much more focused on work here in the UK. And there's a particular UK resonance when we think about diasporas of Jewish and Muslim communities, and we think about the proportions that they represent in our communities. And so there is a difference between this conflict and other conflicts as it plays out and as it has a resonance in the UK, which we can maybe come to in the questions, and we can draw out, which is perhaps what differentiates it from what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is 24 years ago. There was a sort of annexation, and it's been re-annexed, and there's been this historical battle between the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians over this contested territory. But apart from on the Rest is Politics podcast, who else is talking about that? And it's getting zero attention, along with the other 140 conflicts. But there's probably a reason for that. And there's a reason why Israel-Gaza has that resonance globally and has a particular resonance in the UK, which we can perhaps come on to in the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sanjay. And, from everything that each of you has said, this is absolutely about how, which all of you do, exercise that conscious inclusion piece. And Sanjay, you talked about not wanting to pull the ladder up and having fantastic allies and leaders in this space. That is each and every one of you, because this is a subject that we must continue. Diversity as the broader context, as well as the subject we'll get into with the Israel-Gaza conflict, which of course is getting a lot of headlines at the moment and is something key for us to talk about. But ultimately, making sure we keep keep positive momentum behind this when we see everything from, Musk putting on X as it is now, DEI must die, and so on and so forth. We must not be scared to speak out for what is right. And that means having tremendous allies like yourselves who really do care about future generations of leaders and keeping the positive momentum up for all of these initiatives, because it is a commercial lever for economic growth and prosperity, and something that we need our future generations, 5 in the workplace, I think it is now, possibly even 6. It is so important to them. And so looking to individuals like yourselves who have been there, have the voice, have the agency to make change is absolutely key. So a huge big thank you as well to all of you. Now, to get into the Israel-Gaza conflict more specifically, and Sanjay, I'm going to come to yourself here with this question. In your opinion, why do CEOs and leaders need to communicate with their employees during times of crisis like this?
Well, you're communicating whether you communicate or not. By not saying anything, you're also saying something, right? So this goes back to being consciously leading and making conscious decisions. And so this goes beyond employees. This is actually, whenever there's a crisis, I think any organization and its leadership should be thinking about its stakeholders more broadly. So whether that's your shareholders, your investors, your customers, obviously your employees, your supply chain partners, right? You will have a network that's relevant to you, and each big news item, any conflict issue, you have to think about how does that affect you as an organization, and all of those relationships, which obviously your employees are pivotal, but it's all of those other relationships as well. I think there is something slightly different about the Israel-Gaza conflict. As Ben said, there are hundreds of conflicts going on in the world at any one point in time. I think what is resonant about this is we have very significant Muslim communities in the UK from a UK perspective, and a long history of a Jewish diaspora in the UK. There's also something about the resonance of the Israel-Gaza conflict for those Jewish and Muslim communities, in that this is not any old conflict. This is a very symbolic conflict, and it triggers deep emotional reactions in people, not just in the region, but people who have an affinity in the region, or friends who are in the region, or people who feel that they have people of the same religion, that therefore that gives them that affinity with people in the region. There's an Israeli author called Amos Oz who says that with pretty much any conflict in the world, you could distill it to right versus wrong, and that there's a good side and a bad side. He says, with the exception of Israel and Palestine, that is a case of right versus right. Now, I'm not going to comment on whether he's correct about that, but the reason I'm mentioning that is because that drives the deep emotional reaction of our Jewish and Muslim diaspora. And when you add on top of that, so we did an anti-Semitism sort of conversation with a group of Jewish people around sport last week, and just sort of Chatham House rules and getting some feedback from people and how they were feeling. And the reaction, because the Holocaust is in living memory for people, and because of some of the things that we've seen over recent weeks and months, is that for those of us who experience discrimination, we may have several feelings that come up with that. But it's very rare that we have fears, really resonant fears for death and personal insecurity. And that is what is triggered in the Jewish community. For the Muslim community, what we also get is this kind of casual Islamophobia that just occurs on a daily basis, triggered often by mainstream media. And this has been a trope over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and particularly since the rise of Islamist terrorism. So that Muslim communities feel very often as if they are not supported, and as if they are all sort of tarred with a brush. And you look at who has suddenly become a friend of Jewish people. Look who suddenly became friends of the LGBT community during the Qatar World Cup. You have far-right organizations who, for a flag of convenience, are wearing LGBT credentials and anti-Semitic credentials as a thin cloak for their Islamophobia. And so it's very complex. But because we have these communities inside our organizations and outside organizations, actually the potential for that conflict to start happening in our country, in our territories, we've already seen in football. Football teams refusing to play. Well, one incident of a football team refusing to play at grassroots level against a Jewish football team. You know, to me, that's where we start to get engaged. So this is really not acceptable. We don't want that conflict coming here. We want to be talking about how we bring communities together and creating cohesion. But we also have to acknowledge that when we look about, you know, we took for our beneficiaries underrepresented or minority communities, we also have to accept that sometimes those underrepresented minority communities are in conflict with each other. And there are two issues on which, if you want to be absolutely guaranteed to receive abuse on social media, one is to say something about the Israel-Gaza conflict, and the other is to say something about trans rights. And then I can absolutely guarantee you, within 5 minutes, you'll have been insulted, probably by both sides. So it shows how sort of resonant these issues are. That's why I think I'm not saying you necessarily have to say something, but you have to make a decision whether you're saying something or not saying something.
I think when you, in the shock of the initial events, you need to say something. But I think there is a challenge that I do a weekly newsletter, which is global. Do I tell everybody, do I provide a running commentary every week on my feelings about, you know, this, I don't know, Israel or Gaza, when, as I say, for my Latin America, if you're in Ecuador, you know, hi Christina, who runs Ecuador for me, you know, there's all sorts of, there's gunmen on the streets in quite a different set of issues there. So I think it really, you know, there are moments when the world's attention is on something and people want to know that you're standing up for what's right and, let's say, liberal values, which is something that matters to us as a French company. We believe in equality, fraternity, liberty. But I think that really you have to be pragmatic, because I do have a company to run and I can't do a commentary on everything that's happening in the world on a weekly basis. Well, maybe I should. It's a debate, but I don't think so. Ultimately, I've got to run the business.
And it's finding that finite balance. Sorry, David, please feel free to come in.
No, I think both Sanjay and Ben, I mean, I think covered a number of the points. I think it's an incredibly, you know, what is the responsibility of a leader to say what, when, why, how, to who? You know, I think, you know, when you're looking at that, you really have to keep yourself in check, and your broad responsibilities. And this is why I think, you know, getting back to principles of collective responsibility and values. Having, you know, values aren't just a bunch of words we throw out there in a shotgun fashion. They have to be interconnected. You know, one of the things that you know, I work in a human rights organization for the world of sport. So we are always having to behave and act with values as our foundation in every situation, because no situation is simple. When you really start to pull back humanity is not simple by its nature. So, you know, both individually and collectively. So as you look at this, you know, the number one value we uphold is trust. Before anything, if we cannot establish an environment of trust, we have to go back to trust. We build on that. Next is legitimacy. You know, what are the standards we use? What are the approaches that we use? Do they uphold those that we're trying not to harm? And are we harnessing the opportunities that we've set out? But it's built on trust. So trust, legitimacy. And once we've established those elements, we can do all the innovation and collaboration and enablement and impact, you know, whether that's with services or products or convening. But if we can't establish an environment of trust, it's useless. And so I think a lot of companies, as they're putting together their values, which really form the rubric of behaviors and the cultures that we set for one another, I would challenge them to say, how are they interconnected? How are they interdependent? And what is the sequence by which you deliver those values? And the majority of companies I've worked with, public, private, third sector, you name it, haven't really approached their values basis in that construct. And I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned. When you come into these difficult situations, being able to point to something on the wall and say, are we living this? Are we staying true to this in the just discourse that we're having, the respect that we're giving one another, the voice and agency that is so important for every business to really, I think, cherish and protect. These are difficult topics. This is not a simple topic. For everything that Sanjay said, I think, the degrees of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that exist in this world, and the policies and the constructs and the long historical, journeys, and how that has, been used to build, in some cases, the very fabric of the societies that we enjoy right now. Systems of caste and the capitalism and all of this basis. Those elements, have roots and history in some of these truths. And I think that's very difficult, very confronting. But unless you actually have the architecture and the framework, both in terms of, what we hold ourselves to and how we approach the work that we do, then we are actually starting from a very reactive position. And no matter what, as leaders, I would much rather be in a situation where I'm able to be planned, proactive, steering a course or changing a course to some benchmark or guide, versus aimlessly out in the ocean, not sure where the North Star is, and you just have to hunker down and weather a storm, and it's really questionable where you'll make it and where you'll end up. So I think these are just, a few reflections on, just I think beautiful interventions from both Sanjay and Ben.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree, and this is so polarizing and deeply rooted, traumatizing for many. And so, to Ben's point, actually, we have businesses to run. We don't necessarily always have the answers, but actually listening to as many of those different sides and stepping up to show that we actually are listening and we do care is absolutely key. It's a complex, deeply complex environment that we are in right now, littered with news headlines, and as Sanjay, you said, social media, I think at times is really perpetuating a lot of this. And so keeping the voices of reason, quote unquote, if we could call them that, and remembering the North Star, which is actually humanity, living values in a non-performative way, and actually showing that we aren't going to be silent. When we saw back with the brutal murder of George Floyd, many people, kind of stepping up to the table. And as things move on, we see that the momentum is being lost. And so it's actually, how do we keep talking about this through what at times for diverse communities can be real kind of emotional exhaustion to a certain extent, but actually continue to wield the positive flag for good and for better, because we know that doing well, by doing good within all of these communities is what is right ultimately. David, I'm going to come across to you for the next question around why we feel, and I know some of these points we've touched on already, but why business leaders have struggled to an extent to talk to their employees, and how leaders can be encouraged and prepared to speak up during these times of crisis, when actually there's many different many different perceptions and thoughts based on specific individual backgrounds.
You know, I think courage is a real indicator of our comfort of being vulnerable. And I think leaders, and you know, having been a chief executive for 10 and a half years, and happily on a sabbatical right now, I have to say that you know, I think some of the most confronting topics I've had to deal with were really, the biggest challenge was getting out of my own way and really understanding as a leader, where does my opinion start and stop, and where does what is right in terms of what is right for the business begin and end. And I really feel that sometimes we get that confused and start to be, we feel that we have to be the single point of truth and often failure. In times that are tough, you know, do we run and hide, or do we stand up and shield? And I think there's different characters. I always say that there is enormous opportunity in adversity, and it's just whether you have the perspective to connect with it, feel where those opportunities, and then take advantage. Both of, I think, really in terms of, you know, understanding space, time, and position. You know, and is it the right time to move? Is it do I, you know, how far away am I from the where I want to be versus where should I be? And then, you know, ultimately, you know, taking that step to take everyone with you. I think we're often very hierarchical, and the world has become much more of an ecosystem. And I think the systems and the leadership structures that we've established are still very hierarchical. So we're looking for someone to blame, someone to flame when the things go wrong, versus we're actually all have a different remit. We're all in this, and you're more of an orchestrator, leader of getting the best decisions out of the company. And I think those leaders that are able to do that with grace and with gratitude and with compassion and effectiveness and engagement, and establish a culture. You know, if we subscribe to the belief that culture is the worst behavior we're willing to accept, then we need to be firm when we need to be firm, but at the same time have the moral compass and have the consistency to do it according to a really, you know, kind of set of principles. And so I think it's about building those blocks within your teams as a leader that we all subscribe to, so that when you are faced with topics like this, that you have the ability, maybe not to know all the answers or even know exactly what to do, but you can actually get honest perspectives and be able to make better decisions on that. One final point is that when we start to look at ethical decision making, and this has been a real fascination of mine over the past several years, is how and why do we make good ethical decisions? And if you really look at what we kind of derive as ethics, you know, it's kind of 3 points: what is right, what is good, and what is fitting. That's how we're often making decisions. And sometimes what is right is not what is good for the situation. And sometimes what is right and good is not fitting for the business. This is the dilemma that we often have as leaders. And so the more that we can put in place to get to the best decision that balances that and finds the sweet spot, that helps us go forward and that we can live with forever, because, I can tell you, social media will hold on forever to our praises and our criticisms. And that's the burden that we carry as being a progressive, innovative world that we live in. It's, really thinking through how and why, and, ultimately what we decide is really, really important. So just some reflective points to hopefully provoke some thought to how we handle a very, very difficult and divisive issue.
David, your points around specifically the notion on social media around blaming and flaming, I think a lot of the time is true. And this is also something that it fills CEOs and leaders with fear at times, because they are trying to do the best for people, for stakeholders, for shareholders, a growing pool of different stakeholders to keep happy. And ultimately there is not, I think there is, to some of the points you've all made, is there is this fear of having to have and get to that place of perfection, when progress is far more important than that. And at the roots of it, showing, what I've seen in some of the best leaders ever is that humility and that vulnerability, emotional intelligence that says, look, I don't know it all, but I am here to listen. I am here to serve. I was talking to Shireen Cowrie-Hack, who's chief exec of the Co-op, the other day, and for her there was a huge personal piece around this subject, and triggering in many different ways. But actually what they did was they went out to the organization with communications, listened to both and all sides, and sent that round the business, so that actually it was a demonstration of caring, even though you can see the both sides of things, and really want to show at the heart of it that you are listening to as many stakeholder groups as possible. Sanjay, Ben, any comments at all on some of David's reflections there?
Okay, I'll go first. But I think the point about values-based leadership, which is something I believe in strongly, is fundamental. And it's about this point about authenticity. People can spot you a mile off if you're inconsistent, you're not living up to the values, particularly if you've spent some time talking about them. So I think that really matters. But at the same time, there is this, I think one key point I would make is that if you're trying to do this for the whole world at the same time, it is different than if you're doing it in a particular community or in a particular country, because the world is, one of the shocking things about my job actually has been, as a Brit, I have very strong views on a number of conflicts from a number of perspectives. But what I found, of course, in a global organization, those perspectives are very, very different. And that means that we need to stick to at a global level, I'm trying to stick to some fundamental values. But when you come down to very specific actions, they will vary from country to country. And that partly reflects how the world is.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Ben, and I agree with everything both you and David have said. I think we also have to look at these things in context, and it's easier to be brave on some issues than others. And we live in a cancel culture where we are all only one slip of the tongue away from being cancelled. And so when you're walking into a bit of a minefield, you have to be even more careful. So it's much easier to deal with the Russia-Ukraine conflict because one country is invading another, and it's easier to feel like the Amos Oz quote back, I talked about back at the start. It's easier to feel that one side's right and one side's wrong, and so that doesn't present as many difficulties. And of course, there's a timing point here. If you say something on October the 8th, the day after October the 7th, that may be a bit clearer. As soon as you get 3, 4, 5 days later, when you're into the retaliatory action, and actually you're then looking at the context of a 2,000-year conflict,
yes,
then that becomes much more complex.
Yeah.
And so what you say, it's not just what you say, it's when you say it. And so that makes a huge difference as well. And as an organization, if you're the leader of an organization, you have to ask yourself, what's my opinion? What is good for the organization? What's the most important thing for this organization? What's our mission? What are we trying to deliver? How does this align to that mission? What is it that the organization should be saying? And if that creates a risk of exposure, actually, is that risk a risk that's worth taking, or how do you take that, and what should the line be? So the more difficult, this is one of the more difficult issues, if not the most difficult issue, I think, for a corporate to be involved in. And I say some of the other conflicts are so much easier to have a position on.
Well, even Russia and Ukraine, and as I speak as somebody who's hosting a Ukrainian refugee in London, but the view in Paris of that conflict isn't the same as in London, to be quite honest. And it gets, as I say, it gets even more complicated when you talk to your Indian colleagues or some of your colleagues in MENA, in the Middle East and North Africa, or South Africa, who are friends with Putin. All of these things, I think, the tendency of PR advisors, of course, is to say as little as possible about anything. And then, of course, you sound like a bland corporate drone, which none of us want to sound like. But it was interesting. I said a few things about Israel and Gaza, and I immediately got complaints that I wasn't strong enough from both sides. We're present across the region. We're present in Israel. We're even actually present in Gaza. And frankly, nothing I was going to be able to say would please all of my people. And we're back into the point you make, Sanjay, that in some of these conflicts, both sides have pretty good claims in a number of ways. They're both right in some ways. A really, really difficult one. But I think the bottom line is authenticity, and sometimes saying, look, I have a personal view and I'm entitled to a personal view, but also as a leader of a very diverse company, I'm also trying to reflect the worldview, which isn't the same as my personal view always.
I think you make some incredible points there, Ben. And ultimately, we could also argue the point that ensuring that there is good business for all keeps our brilliant employees in their jobs as well. And that is something that sits heavy with a lot of our leaders, how they manage and deal with these crises, how they don't look like bland robots at the same time, because individuals buy into leaders who have that authenticity and show the willingness and the care, whether their personal opinions are of the same ilk as each and every person, because they simply cannot be. Which leads us into the next question, Ben, around how organizations can create safe spaces to really allow constructive dialogues around topics and conflicts like this, and also how. Bearing in mind, I know that we don't have all the answers for everything, but you are doing some brilliant things at Ipsos and with many of your clients to really demonstrate that safe spaces to have these conversations, even when challenging at times, are important.
Well, we run, obviously, part of our work is deliberation, encourage not just opinion polls, which obviously we're best known for, but also we do a lot of work where you're just literally sitting, watching people or listening to people or encouraging dialogues. And we have a whole stream of activity which is around deliberation in divided communities. But that's slightly different when you get into the workplace. And I think that the challenge is, if you've got an office of 1,000 people, there's a relatively small, there's a proportion of people on both sides in those places that will feel very strongly. A lot of other people will care about injustice in the world, but there'll be less exercise. So I think there's a balance to be struck. I tend to leave that, to be quite honest, to my individual country managers, for them to decide what is appropriate in a particular city or in a particular country. But as a general principle, we're trying to celebrate diversity, the diversity of the company, the fact that we're stronger as a range of experiences, backgrounds, etc. But I'm not going to put some cast iron rules down about what you should do in in Saudi Arabia or in Jordan or in Israel on these particular issues, to be quite honest. And I think you do need to give people local discretion, but at the same time, reflecting back on our values and celebrating diversity. And so we will have, groups explaining their experience, whether they're, well, in the case of Britain, I know we've done it for both Jewish and Muslim communities, but I'm not sure I would start saying, right, we now need to have a big discussion about this particular conflict, because in that case, again, we're starting to run into, we're providing a commentary on everything. I mean, what about Yemen? What about Ukraine, Russia? We could be very busy just spending all our time talking about each of these things. But for other people, it may be different. I don't know.
Sanjay, David, I would love to know your thoughts on this, because I can see the complexity of the role of the CEO and leader in this, as Ben has articulately explained that.
I was going to construct. I like the fact that you use the phrase constructive dialogue, right? So I will contrast that with destructive debate, and I think what you can't. I think what Ben was talking about is quite sensibly is, should we set up formal spaces and formal ways for people to have these conversations? I think that, I'm not sure that's helpful, but what you can do is you can acknowledge the fact that people are going to be talking about this, because it's in the news every day and people talk about whatever's in the news every day. So people will be talking about this on the shop floor, whether you like it or not. And I think part of this goes back to what David said about values and how we interact with each other, the way that we work and the way that we talk to each other. One of the things we've been talking about quite a lot at Kick It Out is how do we create a culture of dialogue rather than a culture of debate? And there's a difference between the two. In a debate, I come to the debate having to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. And in a dialogue, I come to it thinking I might be wrong, and my job is to listen to somebody else. So the debate is really good in legal cases, which is adversarial, and in Parliament for testing the limits of what might be some rules you're going to come in. In everyday conversation, debate is destructive. It doesn't create understanding or between people. That's where you need a culture of dialogue. So I think actually saying, we acknowledge that you're going to have these conversations. What we want you to do is to have these conversations in a respectful way, and in a way where you come into the conversation assuming you might be wrong and the other person might have a point and that they might hold that view validly. And as soon as it gets heated, you have to stop. Right. So I think it's about articulating your values as to what you find as acceptable behavior in the workplace.
Yeah, to be honest, we did just fire somebody who decided there was two different minority groups, and one of them decided to viciously abuse the other one. So that isn't how we do things around here, and they immediately left. That was the end of it. Because there are standards, right? And you've got to draw a line, even if they felt very strongly about something. Frankly, you can't express yourself and start making it personal, and just a whole ad hominem type stuff. So there are limits, right? But it's this balance between, and I think it's a very good point, Sanjay, about just saying that there are basics about how we communicate, how we are with people. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, and then it has structure for lunch. My favorite all-time quote at work. So if they're not living up to your culture, I will get rid of you immediately, regardless of how good you are. End of. I just did that in the United States again on another for somebody else who was saying one thing to one lot of people and another thing to somebody else. We do have to have some basic fundamental standards that we absolutely stick to and that everybody knows about. And I think that point about dialogue as opposed to debate is a good one.
I was just going to expand on I think a point just listening to both of you is that, and Ben, it was in your previous intervention on the diversity that we are faced with today. One of it's, I think it's always been there. It's just we're just much more open with it, and we've put names and we've labeled ourselves and others with it. One of the things that I think is enormously underrated, it's becoming more mainstream, but it is enormously underrated when you're dealing with trauma. And we live in systems, and often in the Western world, systems that have been built on caste. and caste constructs, and we are working through our trauma, what we've inherited often, or just the lived experiences that we have that we've journeyed. And I really feel that, you know, issues like this are triggering in many, many different ways. And particularly when you're dealing with both Israelis and Palestinians who are in almost perpetuated states of victimized identities. And you start to, and particularly communities within Western worlds that are also perpetuated as victimized communities. And this is not to say that they're not victimized. We're victims. And I think that's a really, really tough sense of identity. If I let go of that identity, you're confronting the unknown. And so these topics, us as leaders, the many ecosystems we create in our businesses are having to confront trauma every day in weird and wonderful and horrible ways, not even knowing it, and it manifests in people's behaviors. And I really feel that this is, you know, the next frontier. As you know, how do we become trauma-informed leaders that have the ability to support people on their journeys from victims to survivors? And I think through, and how do we create the environments that help them be their authentic selves, but give them the safety and the protection to do that? And I think it comes down to, you know, these are the behaviors we're willing to accept, these are the behaviors we're not willing to accept. And when people cross the line, being definitive, you know, in that. And so I just echo what you said, but I think we need to build on that notion of people are triggered by topics like this in very different ways. And the media plays into it, you know, that we can, you know, there's something for everyone, I always say, in the media, you know, and it is a beautiful, my background is marketing and leadership. So, you know, I as a leader, I could take that and run with it. And as a marketeer, you know, we can commoditize and sell that. You know, it's the brutal reality of the clickbait culture we live in. And I really feel that we as leaders starting to talk about being trauma informed and sensitive in our cultures will help us become more responsible when it comes to the whole diversity, inclusion, equity, that sense of welcome and belonging that we create every day.
Final word from me, just in, you know, I think that's a very good point. I think this is also a world in which mental health has finally overtaken, in terms of the global public's concerns, health, heart disease and cancer. So mental health is, in the last decade and after the pandemic, has shot up. And that, of course, is also part of this conversation that we're having today about, you know, people's mental health is also involved in some of these issues. So we're in a world that's much more willing to talk about many things. And as leaders, we have to facilitate that. End from me.
Mm-hmm. Ben, thank you so much. All of you have been absolutely tremendous. And as you've been talking, it's kind of made me reflect a little bit on stoicism, which I'm trying to get into at the moment. And the obstacle being the way. It's not always the easiest place to be, in particular as a leader who is faced with growing education through the various different stakeholder channels, trying to appease everyone. It is simply not possible. Yet showing courage, vulnerability, and respect whilst living those basic fundamentals in terms of our values. Ben, as you said, actually made me think of a dear friend of mine, a CEO who will be speaking actually later on this summit. He said there's 3 types of people within an organization. There is one who has both the skill and the will, and you would hire them absolutely every day. They're absolutely top number 1. There's those who have the will, but not necessarily the skill, and they are also absolutely fantastic. But finally, you have those that have the skill, but not the will. And those are the ones that must be, to your point, Ben, ejected from organizations. It is critical that we stick with our values, but also we do great business through doing the best that we can to serve all. You've all been incredibly inspirational on this panel. You've been brilliant. It has been a challenging subject to broach, and I think you've all served as brilliant thought leaders and leaders in this space. And so thank you very, very much indeed for your participation. Stay tuned for our next panel. It's coming up very, very shortly after the ad break. If you have been affected by any of the issues, please do make sure that you leave us a comment. We're always trying to be more inclusive as a business and as a summit, talking about some of the most pressing challenges that leaders and businesses are facing today. We've got a brilliant panel lined up for you next. It'll be very thought-provoking and interesting indeed. It's diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, culture's role within crisis management, speaking up and taking action. We have the tremendous chairman of Freud's Advisory, Simon Enright, in addition to Royal Mail's Director of Corporate Affairs, Jenny Hall, and finally Margot Slattery, the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at ISS, and finally the incredible Ian Toll, CEO of Oscar Mayer and FMCG Industry Titan. See you very soon.